This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
I'm extremely excited to be giving a talk today. So the title of my talk is Beyond Infinite Reflection, Nishida's Mathematical Models of Self-Consciousness. And I'm already going to sort of excuse myself. This is a sort of topic that I'm really interested in, but at the same time, my knowledge of math is extremely poor, and so I've been struggling to understand what Nishida is talking about for a very long time. But I've challenged myself to give a talk on this topic so that I can better understand him. And I thought that, instead of waiting for me to understand what Nishida is talking about, in depth for myself, I thought that if I can try to somehow make it, comprehensible to some extent, then you can sort of fill in the rest for me, and I can help. I can get your help to understand better what Nishida is talking about, since I think the audience here is much more knowledgeable than me regarding this matter. So yeah, please do help me out. Um, but yeah, I'll start with a bit of an introduction to sort of where I'm coming from in terms of my research interests. So currently, I'm part of this big grant research project called the Qualia Structure, establishing super interdisciplinary research program to bridge a gap between subjective conscious experience and scientific objectivity. And if you look at this sort of the people who are involved here, it's really very interdisciplinary. And the Nautsia is he is leading the project. So we've got psychophysics people, we've got math people, neuroscientists, roboticists, psychology, developmental psychologists. But we've also got this philosophy team, particularly phenomenology team here, and to try to understand what exactly is qualia from a first person perspective. But with when we talk about qualia, we're more talking from the perspective of philosophy of mind. But here we're more sort of pushing phenomenology, so the more sort of traditional phenomenology with Husserl and others. So yeah, I'm part of this phenomenology team, and we are trying to understand what the phenomenology of qualia structure is. And the basic idea behind this qualia structure project is to try to understand qualia not by looking at sort of the isolated quels or qualia, whatever you want to call them, by looking at the structure, so that there sort of the relationship between qualias or qualia. And so the relationship, that the general idea is that we are taking the relationship first or the structure first. And this sort of approach is quite similar to the approach of the phenomenology that we're interested in this project, but also of Japanese philosophy in general. So I have one foot in phenomenology and then another foot in Japanese philosophy, and particularly Kyoto School philosophy. So I'm not sure to what extent you are aware of the Kyoto School philosophy, but Nishida Kitarō is the founder of the Kyoto School tradition, and he is often said to be the first modern Japanese philosopher. He sought a kind of dialogue between East Asian spiritual and intellectual traditions, and specifically Zen Buddhism and Western philosophy, including phenomenology which was quite quite influential at that time when he was writing. In his analysis of the structures of consciousness, Nishida was very much interested in understanding the structures of consciousness. Um, he comes to critically adopt the noesis noema correlation in phenomenology. So there is that sort of connection to phenomenology, but his relationship to phenomenology is mostly polemical. So he was very quite critical of phenomenology. He read Husserl's logical investigations and ideas in some depth. Um, but his main criticism towards phenomenology was that it fails to account for the deeper structures of consciousness. By deeper structures, he's talking about sort of not just the sort of intentional correlation, but the sort of constitutive dimensions of consciousness. And so, of course, this is something that, Husserl does take up in his development of genetic phenomenology later on. The thing is, Nishida wasn't really aware of that. And yeah, to what extent he would have really um, sort of agreed with that approach is also debatable. But in any case, I think despite the sort of historical relationship between Nishida and Husserl or phenomenology, more generally phenomenology, I think we can still say that Nishida's approach is very much phenomenological in the sense that he takes experiential givenness as a starting point of his philosophy. So the fact that there seems to be experience and there is this sort of rich experience that is given to us. So that's the starting point of his inquiry, but it's also the end point. Ultimately, he wants to go back to this direct experience. Um, Regarding his relationship to mathematics, mathematics was the central concern for Nishida throughout his life. When he was younger, in his high school days, when he started to think about his career, he did seriously consider becoming a mathematician. So he had two options, becoming a philosopher or becoming a mathematician. His high school teacher and his mentor that he really looked up to, Hojo Tokiyuki, was a mathematician himself, and he regarded Nishida's knowledge in math highly, and so he encouraged Nishida to pursue math. But Nishida at some point said that he didn't have the courage to pursue mathematics because he felt that it was a bit dry compared to philosophy. So in the end, he decides to become a philosopher, but his passion for mathematics continues, and he did write several essays focusing on mathematics. His first book came out in 1911. So early on, he already wrote on math, understanding in logic and in mathematics. That's probably the first essay where he writes extensively on math, on how he understands mathematics. But it's really in his very late years. So he passed away in 1945. So it's in those last few years where he devotes a fair bit of writing to understanding math. So he doesn't really develop a philosophy of mathematics as such, and Nishida scholars haven't really, you know, spent so much time trying to sort of identify a philosophy of mathematics in Nishida's philosophy. But nonetheless, I think in a sense, Nishida was trying to develop something like mathematics, and he believed that mathematical expressions are an abstract, symbolic expression of the structures of the world or of reality, and should be appreciated as such. So especially later on, having sort of established his sort of final philosophical standpoint, he wants to go back and try to provide a mathematical expression of how he understood the structure of the world. So what I'm mainly interested in is trying to establish or trying to explore the contemporary relevance of Nishida's philosophy. and more specifically, how we might be able to apply some of Nishida's ideas to consciousness research. Those are the main sort of questions that I'm concerned with or I'm interested in right now. And thinking about sort of reflecting on what I'm really interested in, more generally speaking, I'd say that I'm interested in various forms of translation. So not literally translation. Actually, there's a lot of work in Nishida that hasn't been translated into English. So that needs to be done, but I'm actually not really interested in that sort of translation. I'm interested in translation, or we might call mapping, to sort of use the language that we're going to be speaking today, between I'm interested in translation between cultures. So I was brought up in the United States, but my parents are Japanese, and I've spent a good chunk of time in Japan now. So I've been sort of living in between cultures. So I myself see I am a very sort of intercultural person, I think. I live in between cultures, and so I've been interested in, this sort of translation between cultures. But culture here, I don't mean just sort of ethnic culture, but also disciplinary culture. So I'm also interested right now, especially I'm sort of putting myself in between different disciplines, and trying to really speak with non-philosophers, which has been challenging, but also extremely rewarding and really exciting right now. Um, and sort of going meta, I've also been interested in the question of what characterizes a good translator. Someone who can sort of map different domains, what characterizes a good sort of maker. And together with Olaf Witkowski, who's been working on consciousness, who's works in the field of A life, but who also happens to be my life partner. We've been working on this notion of playfulness as a sort of virtue and a skill. Playfulness is as understood as this sort of ability to freely go in and out of different domains. And this ability, I think, allows one to sort of navigate different domains. And be able to sort of make interesting connections. So that's another sort of side thing that I'm interested in. But I'm also interested in translating more sort of more specifically, I guess I'm also interested in translating Nishida's philosophy into a more accessible language. Accessible not just to, other philosophers who don't work on Nishida, but to a more wider audience, including an audience like you today. And also translating Nishida's core concepts like Jikaku, which means self-consciousness, the one that I'll be talking about today, or Basho, which means place. Translating these core concepts to contemporary discussions in philosophy of mind and consciousness research. So I think there's a lot there. There's a rich idea in Nishida's philosophy that does require a mapping. So into this different domain. And there's definitely common ground there, but I think it needs to be explored. So this is the sort of thing I'm interested in right now. Okay, so today what I want to do, using the rest of the time I have, is to introduce Nishida's use of mathematical models and understanding the structures of self-consciousness. Again, the word is in Japanese is Jikaku. And in particular, I want to trace the trajectory of the evolution of Nishida's use of mathematical models from infinite sets. So he starts using infinite sets, but then he moves on to using group theory and specifically this idea of transformations or permutations. So how does Nishida initially attempt to model self-consciousness based on the idea of infinite sets? But he comes to see the limitations of this model. So what was wrong with this model? And how does group theory prove to be a better model? So I'm hoping that tracing this trajectory will shed some light on how Nishida understood the structures of self-consciousness. And so I said that we'll end with some reflections on Nishida's intention behind his use of mathematical models, but I must say that I didn't really have time to develop this this thought in details. This is something that I think would be nice to discuss later. Okay, so just to sort of give you a background of where Nishida's coming from, I think it's important to understand this idea of pure experience, which is the first concept that he introduces in his work, An Inquiry into the Good. That's his first work in 1911. Here, Nishida introduces pure experience as the immediate, non-dual experience prior to judgment and reflection, and attempts to explain everything on the basis of pure experience as the sole reality. So here's a passage where he explains what pure experience is, and this is on the first page of this book. The moment of seeing a color or hearing a sound, for example, is prior not only to the thought that the color or sound is the activity of an external object or that one is sensing it, but also to the judgment of what the color or sound might be. In this regard, pure experience is identical with direct experience. When one directly experiences one's own state of consciousness, there's not yet a subject or an object, and knowing and its object are completely unified. So pure experience is defined as a sort of non-dual, immediate experience. Now, for Nishida, this pure experience is not just a sort of experiential fact, but as he says at the very beginning of the book, he says that he wants to explain everything on the basis of this concept as a sole reality. So in order to do that, he needs to he wants to say that this is the foundation for all reality and knowledge. In order to do that, he needs to clarify how this sort of non-dual experience relates to dual experience, to dualities, and more generally, reflection. So how does reflection fit into the picture? How does the immediate non-dual experience relate to reflection? And this question was not fully developed in this work. So in order to tackle this question that he was left with after writing this book, he turns to self-consciousness, or Jikaku, as a potential candidate for resolving this problem. And this is because in self-consciousness, there is a sense in which there's both duality and there is both a duality and non-duality. So in self-consciousness, I reflect on myself. So there is a knower-known distinction. There's a reflective moment. But also, I immediately experience that the knower and known are the same, right? It's because I am myself. It's a sort of immediate knowledge. This is why he thinks that there's something in self-consciousness that would allow us to sort of understand the unity of reflection and what he calls intuition, or this sort of immediate, direct, non-dual experience. So his second major work, Intuition and Reflection in Self-Consciousness, is an attempt to understand reality based on the structures of what he calls a self-aware system. And in the preface of the book, he recalls that the inspiration to his understanding of Jikaku, self-consciousness, came from the work of an American pragmatist and proponent of absolute idealism, Josiah Royce. And Josiah Royce wrote this a book titled The World and the Individual, where he explores this highly metaphysical question of the relationship between one and the many, or the absolute and the individuals. And in the supplementary essay to it's quite a long supplementary essay. In that supplementary essay to that work, Royce attempts to explain the metaphysical relationship between the one and only absolute and the many in mathematical terms. And in the work, Royce turns to Richard Dedekind's definition of an infinite set that appears in his essay, Was sind und was sollen sein? What are and what should numbers be? And there he says that, there he defines an infinite set as follows. He says, a system S is said to be infinite when it is similar namely when it can be mapped one to a proper part of itself. And shortly after that, he provides a proof to this infinite set. There he says, there exist infinite systems, proof, my own realm of thoughts. In other words, the totality S of all things, which can be objects of my thought, is infinite. So as a proof of this infinite set, it's quite surprising that he provides not a mathematical proof, but a non-mathematical, extra mathematical sort of proof from his own, namely from his own experience, my own realm of thoughts. So I can think of S, whatever it is, and S is an element of the totality S, which can be object of my thought. Now I can form a second order thought. S is an object of my thought, and this S dash would be an element of this capital S dash. Now S corresponds element for element to S dash. The content would be mirrored into the second order thought. And S dash is part of S, but it's also a proper part since it leaves out. Dedekind says it leaves out at least the ego. So he thinks that it leaves out perhaps other things, but at least the ego. And by ego, he's talking about the sort of thinker of the thought. And in this sense, it is infinite. So this is Dedekind's definition of infinite set, and he has provided a proof of his own realm of thoughts. So a lot of mathematicians have apparently criticized this proof as not really being proof at all, because again, it's an extra sort of non-mathematical proof. But it's interesting that both Royce and Nishida found it quite fascinating. And they take reflective thought as a prototype of an infinite system. I think this is quite interesting. It's really quite interesting that Dedekind offers this sort of proof. I think it's very easy to dismiss this sort of proof as not being mathematical, but the fact that he had to resort to this sort of proof and call it a proof, I think is very interesting. It sort of relates to this talk of mapping earlier. He saw that there's something, this sort of sense of this idea of infinity has to go back to our experiences. Is I think just a very interesting fact in itself. So Royce, drawing on Dedekind, calls this sort of an infinite system self-representative system. And he provides an example of drawing a perfect map of England within England. So this is supposed to be an example of a self-representative system. So for the map to be perfect, which is to say there's a one-to-one correspondent between each part of the region and the image in the map, it would have to contain a representation of itself within the map. But the representation itself would have to contain a further representation and so on ad infinitum, right? So you're drawing a map of England, and then once you have drawn the map, that map itself is also within England, so you need that it would require that you draw again and so on infinitum. So Royce goes on to interpret self-consciousness as such a self-representative system, and Nishida follows his steps by interpreting Jikaku as a self-representative system that mirrors itself infinitely. He says, as Royce saw, a single project of mirroring or reflecting the self within the self inevitably generates an unlimited series, just as if one wished to make a completely adequate map of England on the surface of that country, each realization of this plan would immediately generate the project of another map, including the previous one, within itself in a never-ending process. So Nishida comes to formulate the structure of Jikaku as the self mirrors itself within itself. But there were two related problems in formulating Jikaku as this sort of infinite activity of self-mirroring. In the perfect map example, the very activity of drawing the map can never be mapped. And likewise, when self-consciousness is understood as the self-mirroring itself, the mirroring self forever evades our grasp. So during this period, Nishida comes to understand this self, the mirroring self, as a limit point that cannot be reached through reflection. And I think this is similar to the idea that Wittgenstein speaks about in the Tractatus when he compares the self to the I and says that the I cannot see itself. And from this, he concludes that the self is a limit of the world. It's not really something that we can have an experience of. It's just a limit of the world. This problem is related to a more general problem of trying to understand self-consciousness as a form of object awareness. So any attempt to represent the self as an object leaves out the original self, the original mirroring self, the activity of reflecting. Traditionally, phenomenologists have argued that the self, for this reason, is not primarily given as an object at all, but is rather the very standpoint or point of view from which objects are experienced. So, for example, Sartre says every positional consciousness of an object is at the same time a non-positional consciousness of itself. So we have this is to say that when I am conscious of my computer, at the same time, I am conscious of myself. And this is not, this self-awareness is not a further awareness, additional awareness, but he calls it a non-positional consciousness of itself. So it's more like a point of view. And phenomenologists like to speak of it as a pre-reflective self-awareness. So the model of infinite sets nicely captures the infinite activity of reflection and self-consciousness. But as long as reflection is understood as a form of an objectifying act, it cannot properly capture the givenness of this point of view, right? So as Wittgenstein said, it's just a limit point, the limit of the world, as Wittgenstein put it. But that's not really phenomenologically satisfying to just simply call it a limit of the world, because this point of view is directly given in our experience. Another related problem with this model was that Jikaku understood under this model of the infinite sets remains self-contained. So the infinite activity of self-mirroring takes place within the bounds of the self that's inherently closed. So Nishida's, again, the formulation of Jikaku was the self mirrors itself within itself. So the sort of, it's just sort of recursive within the bounds of the self. This means that the point of view is not only excluded under this model, but it's also taken to exist in isolation. And this was a problem for Nishida since he was seeking to ground the whole of reality based on the structure of Jikaku. So the Jikaku structurally had to be open. It was a problem that it was closed. So Jikaku should structurally include our relation to the world and to others around us. So in other words, the self mirrors itself within itself should be the self mirrors itself through others, right? It should structurally contain others and the world within it. And here I want to turn to how Jikaku is used in ordinary speech. So in Japanese, Jikaku is a word that we use in everyday speech. And it's interesting to see that the way Jikaku is used in everyday language, suggests this sort of openness to the world and to others. And I should note that Nishida himself doesn't talk about the relationship between his philosophical concept, that this sort of technical sense of Jikaku, and how the word is used in everyday speech. But I think it's interesting to see this connection. It's quite revealing. Also, Jikaku is originally a Buddhist word meaning self-awakening. Literally, Ji is self, Kaku means awakening or enlightenment. Today, when we use this word Jikaku in everyday language, everyday speech, this sort of religious or spiritual connotation is lost, but it still carries the meaning of coming to a sort of realization. So for example, we say, I have Jikaku as a Japanese, which is to say, I understand myself as a Japanese. The question is, how is such an understanding achieved? This sort of self-understanding of myself as a Japanese. Um, this sort of self-understanding in the sense of Jikaku cannot really be achieved sort of formally, purely formally, in the sense of just sort of analyzing what it means to be Japanese. Um, but this sort of jikaku can only arise by engaging with the surrounding social and cultural environment and with others in it. So, for example, I think typically the sort of jikaku as a Japanese um, is it kind of comes up or is developed not just when you are relating to other people, but especially when you encounter when you are put into a different cultural context and when you become mindful of other people and how the way you understand yourself is very different from the way other people understand themselves. So through this sort of engagement with others, and it's really by being open to your surrounding environment that you become mindful and aware of of your of your own identity. So jikaku in ordinary parlance entails being disclosed to one's place, to the environment, and to others. And this is why so this already contrasts with how self-consciousness, the word self-consciousness is usually understood in English or in German, namely as sort of self-contained. The word self-consciousness in English or German doesn't really have this sort of open connotation of being open to the world or to other people. This is also another reason why when I talk about Jikaku, I don't translate it to self-awareness or self-consciousness. I stick with the term Jikaku because it just has a very different connotation. Also, a closer look at Royce's perfect map example reveals that discloseness to one's place is an essential condition for a self-representative system. So in Royce's example, drawing a perfect map of England within England was taken to be a case of a self-representative system. But what makes this example to be a case of a self-representative system is precisely that the map maker is situated in England. So within England is an essential component here, obviously, because if the person was outside of England, then they would draw the map and that would just be it. So in order for it to be a sort of for the activity to become an infinite activity, the map maker has to be situated in England. And this means that the self of the self-representative system in this example is not a self-contained pre-existing self that relates to England post factum, but is a self that is inherently disclosed to England. In other words, discloseness to the place is constitutive of the self. So this sort of relates to the Heideggerian idea of being in the world, right? We are always already sort of disclosed to the world. Now, Nishida, Nishida, nor Royce for that matter, was focusing on the self-disclosedness when he first cited Royce's example. We can say that it was already there implicitly in its initial formulation, as we just saw. And this is why, upon realizing the limitations of formulating Jikaku with the model of infinite sets, Nishida, instead of abandoning this model altogether, he attempts to refine his concept of Jikaku. And structurally, what this meant was that so the initial formulation was the self mirrors itself within itself. He keeps this formulation, he sticks with it, he never abandons this formulation, but he emphasizes the third element in Jikaku. So there are three components in this formulation. The first self, the self as a subject, mirrors itself, which is the self as an object, and then there's a third component within itself, which is the self as the place. And importantly, within itself, again, doesn't mean within a self-contained, isolated self, which the imagery of the infinite set or the imagery, the initial imagery sort of suggested. The initial imagery suggested this sort of self-contained, isolated self, but he comes to realize that within itself here means within the self that is inherently disclosed to its place. Right? So this sort of disclosedness becomes pivotal here. And this renewed sense of Jikaku entailed a self-representative system that is inherently open. So now he's refining his formulation of Jikaku towards towards an open system, an open to the world and to others. So Nishida's discovery of basho as a philosophical concept signified an important turn in his philosophy. So basho it means place. And he soon develops what he calls a logic of basho, which is at once an epistemological and a metaphysical theory. And I'm not going to go into this logic of basho in any detail here, but just to give you a bit of a snippet, he was trying to come up with a sort of theory of knowledge that wouldn't start with the subject-object reality. So the modern epistemological framework, and specifically the Neo-Kantian at that time, Neo-Kantianism was very influential at the time. They understood knowledge in terms of the act of the epistemic subject. So they take the epistemic subject as a starting point and try to understand knowledge from there. Nishida doesn't want to start there. He wants to start with something that wouldn't necessarily imply subject-object reality. So he starts with subsumptive judgment and the structure of a subsumptive judgment, S is P, and he reinterprets this as the subject term being placed in the predicate. So S is within P. So you see how the sort of notion of place is being employed here again. And this then allows him to interpret the act of judgment or consciousness in general as the transcendental predicate plane, or the place wherein judgment takes place. So there is a sort of basho or the place of judgment, and then he seeks he sort of goes beyond takes the predicate into a different level, and he calls this the transcendental predicate plane, which is the conditional possibility for judgment, and he understands consciousness to be this sort of place. So his logic of basho is as a sort of multi-layered theory of knowledge, and ultimately this culminates in what he calls the place of absolute nothingness, which is a sort of non-dual place. Yeah, there's a lot to be said there, but I'm not going to go into any detail for our purposes today. So the concept of basho developed out of a deeper understanding of the structure of Jikaku, becoming sort of recognizing that what makes Jikaku particularly Jikaku-like is that there is this sort of place character to it. Which the sort of, or in other words, that there is a sort of openness to the place. So what does this say about the mathematical model he was employing? Should we get rid of the model of an infinite set, or is there a way in which we can rescue it? Could we have a deeper understanding of sets that would allow us to model the structure of a Jikaku now understood as an open system? And Nishida seems to have thought that this was possible in his later years when he suggests drawing on group theory as a more suitable model for Jikaku. So he understood that group theory is a sort of deepening of our understanding of sets. In the essay, The Philosophical Foundations of Mathematics, so this is from 1945, the year when he passes away, he proposes to interpret set as basho-like. He also writes that a set becomes a group when the elements become subordinated to the rule, and by rule, I think he means binary operation. So in these passages, Nishida seems to be suggesting that the key difference between a set and a group is that in the latter, the elements are related to other elements in the same group through a sort of binary operation, and that this is what makes groups basho-like. But these passages are sort of cryptic, and it's very difficult to really understand what Nishida is trying to say. How exactly is a group basho-like? And here I want to turn to Ohashi Ryosuke is a prominent Nishida scholar who has sort of suggested one interpretation. I want to follow his interpretation today. This is the definition of a group. And I think most of you know what a group is, so I won't go into any detail, and it's not really so important, I think, for our purposes here. So I'm just going to go pass over that. But Ohashi has proposed that the key to understanding Nishida's reference to group theory lies in the notion of self-identity. So under the model of infinite sets, Jikaku was understood as this sort of self-mirroring of a self that is self-identical with itself. So Ohashi calls this a self-identity of a set, right? So we talked about how Jikaku as a self-mirroring of itself was self-contained. It was a closed system. Later, this self-identity is replaced by what Nishida later comes to call contradictory self-identity, where the self's identity is maintained by negating its own identity. This is why it's contradictory, by negating its own identity and relating to the world and to others. And according to Ohashi, Nishida believed that group theory could provide a nice expression of this contradictory self-identity, since a group and its elements are in a kind of contradictory self-identity, and he calls this a self-identity of a group. And here, Ohashi turns to transformation groups or permutation groups to explain the self-identity of a group. And in particular, he doesn't say as such, but he is talking about symmetric groups, I believe. Symmetry of a set M of an object is a permutation. Let's see, in this sort of symmetric group G3, where the elements are 1, 2, 3, all of these S1, S2, S3, S4, S5, X6, X6 are all permutations, different permutations. So in S1, you've got identity, S2, 1 is 1, and then 2 is becomes 3, and 3 becomes 2. And so these are all unique permutations. So the group, the symmetric group, the elements of the symmetric group are S1, S2, S3, S4, S5, and S6. And Ohashi says that while G does not appear as such in each of the permutations, since they take place within this group, the symmetric group G is implicit within each permutation as their place. So you sort of see how he's trying to relate this with the idea of place. And he compares each of the permutations to an individual person with its own unique mappings. So from the perspective of S1, all these other permutations, S2 to S6, are distinct individuals, which S1 may or may not have any sort of real relation with. But from the perspective of the group, it's precisely by virtue of belonging to group G and relating to other individuals that it qualifies as S1. So this means that the self-identity of G consists in its permutations, right? It does G doesn't really have a sort of self-contained identity. The self-identity of G consists in its permutations, if we can call it a self-identity at all. And each of the permutations mirror each other, which is constitutive of their own self-identity. So the self-identity of a group is not a self-contained identity of G, nor of each of the permutations, but it's a sort of contradictory self-identity. So what does Nishida mean when he says that a set should be interpreted as basho-like? Well, the elements of a set have no intrinsic relation to other elements in the set. The elements of the group are intrinsically related to the other elements and to the group itself, since the elements are expressions of the group. So in the group, there's a sort of both a horizontal and a vertical sort of relation at play. In this way, Nishida believed that group theory provides a more suitable model for understanding the structures of Jikaku, because it sort of articulates this sort of open structure that the model of the infinite sets was not able to provide. Okay, so coming to conclusion, and it's not, I must admit, it's not really a conclusion at all. Reflecting on his use of mathematical models, Nishida makes the following statement. He says, although I have said that the self-forming creative world is group theoretical, I'm not suggesting to understand the world through the analogy of group theory. I do not intend to think of the world mathematically. Rather, I want to do the opposite, what he says. And here, Nishida seems to be suggesting that he wants to interpret mathematics through his philosophical standpoint. So when using mathematical models, he's not trying to use math to understand sort of the metaphysical properties of the world. Rather, it's the other way around. He wants to understand or interpret math philosophically from his philosophical standpoint. So what does this say about his use of mathematical models? I am sort of ending with this question rather than sort of providing an answer, because I'm not quite really sure what exactly he was trying to do. But yeah, I think that he was trying to seek a way, in a sense, he was trying to sort of provide philosophical foundation to math, but at the same time, he'll believe that these mathematical models can provide a sort of precise expression, symbolic expression of reality in the way he understood it. Okay, I think I'm going to end there. Thank you.